This is my Bible study over the six essential questions. I'm going to have to do a three-part video to this, doing two questions on each video. Let me close that. Um, so let's just get right into it. The six essential questions are who, what, where, when, why, and how. We're going to start with the who question. Who is God? So, to do this question, or to answer it, we're going to go to Saul's conversion. So we find Saul in Acts chapter 9 on his genocide route against the Lord's disciples. In Acts chapter 9, verse 1, we read, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem." Verse 3, as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. Verse 4 says, he fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And then verse 5 says, "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. Saul thought he knew who the Lord was, but actually he did not know Jesus. That was until God showed up in the middle of the street and met Saul, who was on his way to kill more Christians. When Saul was blinded by the light, he asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And Jesus replies with, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." He answers him right then and there, saying who he is. You see, Jesus had a plan for Saul. But for that plan to be fulfilled, Saul really needed to know who Jesus was. And we're the same way. God has a plan for us. And we don't know what that plan is. We need to make sure we really know who God is so that he can use us in his plan. We need to make sure our personal relationships with God are good enough to know who he is and for him to know us. Our next question is what? What is God doing? And to answer this question, we are going to the aftermath of Pentecost, when the Holy Ghost fell for the first time. So in Acts chapter 2, we find that a group of people have gotten the Holy Ghost for the first time ever in history, and they began going into the streets. People were confused and were wondering what the group of people who were speaking different languages were doing. Some speculated that they were drunk, but Peter answered what it was. He then goes on to say in Acts 2:14, "Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. 'Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say.'" Verse 15, "These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It is only 9 in the morning." Verse 16, "No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel." Then verse 17 says, "In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams." Verse 18, "Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy." Verse 19, "And I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs in the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke." Verse 20, "The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord." Verse 21, "And whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." You see, Peter described what God was doing to these people on that day. He answered their question. Even though this wasn't really God answering the question, Peter obviously had a revelation and he just displayed what it was to these people. And that alone got 3,000 people to be added to the church and get the Holy Ghost too. And sometimes we don't know what God is doing. Only God knows what he's doing. But as I said before, we need to trust in his plan. And that is the last question I'm doing in this one. The next question will be where, but I will do that in the next part. I will see you all then.